Being bisexual in modern culture creates a very specific kind of exhaustion. Not because attraction is confusing, but because people keep demanding certainty from something deeply human. And certainty performs better socially than complexity ever will. That's the part nobody says out loud. The world claims to celebrate fluidity now. Identity, expression, authenticity, but only when it can still categorize you fast enough to stay comfortable. Because modern society does not actually reward emotional complexity. It rewards emotional readability, quick labels, instant interpretation, algorithm-friendly identities. People want to know what box to place you in before they decide how safe you are to emotionally process. And bisexual people often become psychologically exhausting to people who are addicted to certainty. Not because bisexuality is complicated, but because ambiguity terrifies emotionally conditioned minds, especially in a culture obsessed with immediate emotional conclusions. That changes the way bisexual people move through relationships, quietly, over time, because eventually, you start noticing that people are not reacting to who you are. They're reacting to what they can't confidently categorize. And those are very different experiences. A bisexual person can walk into both straight and queer spaces and still feel psychologically homeless inside both. Not fully rejected, which almost hurts more, because partial acceptance creates a different kind of loneliness. Quieter one that's harder to explain. You're visible enough to be discussed, desired enough to be sexualized, included enough to avoid open exclusion, but not emotionally understood enough to relax. That creates hypervigilance, constant emotional monitoring, constant self-editing. You start adjusting how you describe yourself depending on who you're around. Not because you're fake, because you already know what assumptions are about to happen. Around straight people, you get treated like confusion. Around queer people, you sometimes get treated like temporary uncertainty. Like you're emotionally between stages. Like your identity is still loading. And after enough of those interactions, you stop feeling misunderstood occasionally. You start expecting misunderstanding permanently. That changes people, especially psychologically, because human beings can survive disagreement more easily than prolonged emotional invalidation. And bisexual people experience a very specific form of invalidation. Interpretive invalidation. People constantly trying to translate your identity into something simpler than it actually is. People trying to decode you instead of understand you. And interpretation is exhausting, because interpretation analyzes. Understanding relaxes. That distinction matters more than people realize. A lot of bisexual people become emotionally exhausted not from hiding themselves, but from constantly preparing themselves to be misread. That preparation becomes automatic. You begin calculating reactions before conversations even happen. Who will sexualize it? Who will dismiss it? Who will think it's attention-seeking? Who will assume infidelity? Who will reduce it to experimentation? Who will quietly stop taking your relationships seriously? And eventually, your nervous system stops experiencing identity as self-expression. It starts experiencing identity as risk management. That's when exhaustion becomes chronic, especially online, because the internet made identity more visible than ever before, while simultaneously making nuance harder to survive. Social media rewards emotional simplification, clear branding, clear narratives, clear categories. The algorithm understands certainty better than complexity. And bisexuality exists in a psychologically inconvenient space for people addicted to binary thinking. Modern culture constantly says, "Be yourself," but secretly rewards people who are easiest to immediately understand. That contradiction slowly damages people, especially emotionally adaptive people, because bisexual individuals often become masters of emotional shapeshifting, reading rooms instantly, adjusting language instantly, reducing complexity instantly. You learn how to present different versions of yourself depending on the emotional comfort level of others. That survival mechanism becomes dangerous over time, because emotional adaptation slowly turns into emotional fragmentation. You stop asking, "What do I feel?" and start asking, "What version of myself creates the least friction here?" That's not authenticity anymore. That's psychological self-surveillance. And people rarely notice how exhausting that becomes, especially in dating culture, because modern dating is heavily built around emotional convenience. Instant attraction, instant labels, instant predictability. People now approach relationships like emotional filtering systems, fast compatibility scans, and bisexuality disrupts that simplistic framework. Not because it's unstable, because it forces people to confront uncertainty. A lot of individuals claim they want emotionally open-minded partners, until openness stops being predictable. Then insecurity appears. Quietly, jealousy becomes layered. Comparison becomes chronic. Emotional scanning intensifies. A bisexual partner often becomes psychologically observed differently. Not always openly, but subtly. Questions become loaded. Past relationships become evidence collections. Preferences become overanalyzed. And the bisexual person slowly feels less emotionally trusted and more emotionally monitored. That creates a brutal psychological contradiction. You become hypervisible while feeling emotionally unseen. Desired publicly, questioned privately, accepted socially, distrusted relationally. And contradictions like that exhaust the nervous system, especially over years, because eventually you stop trying to fully explain yourself. Not because you don't know who you are, because emotional translation fatigue starts setting in. People underestimate how tiring it becomes to repeatedly justify your own emotional reality. Especially when both straight and queer spaces sometimes project completely opposite assumptions onto you. One side assumes repression, the other assumes instability, and somewhere in the middle, you're just trying to exist without being psychologically dissected every 5 minutes. That exhaustion becomes invisible, which makes it worse, because invisible exhaustion receives no emotional accommodation. People only empathize with pain they can easily identify. And bisexual exhaustion is psychologically subtle. It hides itself inside jokes, inside adaptability, inside social performance, inside emotional over-explaining. A lot of bisexual people become incredibly emotionally intelligent for survival reasons. You learn how to read discomfort immediately. You learn how to soften yourself before others become uncomfortable. You learn how to emotionally pre-manage conversations. That level of emotional awareness sounds healthy on the surface. But hyper-awareness developed through survival rarely feels peaceful internally. Feels exhausting, because you're constantly emotionally multitasking, tracking reactions, tracking assumptions, tracking tension, tracking invisibility, even in spaces that claim to be accepting. And eventually, you stop craving attention. You start craving emotional rest. That's the part many people don't understand. The deepest desire is not always validation. Sometimes it's finally being around people where your identity stops becoming a discussion topic entirely. No decoding, no suspicion, no subtle interrogation, just psychological stillness. Because bisexual exhaustion is not always caused by hatred. Sometimes it's caused by endless emotional processing, constant explaining, constant clarifying, constant proving. And proving your existence over and over again slowly disconnects people from themselves. Especially when modern culture already pressures everyone into emotional performance systems. Online identities, curated personalities, algorithmic attractiveness. People now optimize themselves constantly. Bisexual people often become exceptionally skilled at this, because adaptation became survival early. You learn which parts of yourself feel safe to reveal in certain environments. That repeated self-editing creates emotional distance from your own identity. Not dramatic distance, subtle distance, the dangerous kind, the kind that happens slowly enough to normalize itself. Until one day, you realize you haven't relaxed psychologically in years, because your nervous system has been preparing for emotional interpretation nonstop. And what makes this even darker is that many bisexual people become incredibly good at appearing emotionally unaffected. Humor becomes camouflage. Confidence becomes camouflage. Sexual openness becomes camouflage. Meanwhile, internally, there's chronic emotional fatigue from constantly being partially understood. Partial visibility still hurts, even when people call it acceptance. Because visibility is not the same as emotional recognition. And being seen is not the same as being understood. Modern culture confuses those things constantly. People think exposure creates connection. It doesn't. Sometimes it only creates observation. And bisexual people often become heavily observed emotionally, without ever feeling fully emotionally located by others. That creates loneliness in crowded spaces. A very modern kind of loneliness. The kind where people know things about you, but still don't psychologically see you clearly. And eventually, that exhaustion changes the way you attach to people. You stop looking for perfect acceptance. You start looking for emotional safety. For spaces where your identity does not require constant maintenance. For relationships where attraction does not become evidence. For conversations where you don't feel psychologically analyzed for existing naturally. Because the real exhaustion of being bisexual in a world obsessed with labels is not confusion. It's chronic emotional negotiation. Negotiating assumptions. Negotiating stereotypes, negotiating visibility, negotiating legitimacy, over and over again, until exhaustion becomes personality-shaped. And the terrifying part is, many bisexual people become so adapted to this emotional labor, they stop recognizing it as exhaustion at all. It just starts feeling like normal life. Quietly. Over time, without them noticing, until one day they meet someone who doesn't psychologically interrogate their identity, and their entire nervous system reacts to the absence of pressure. Not excitement, relief, because emotionally exhausted people do not always crave intensity. Eventually, they crave environments where they can finally stop explaining themselves.